I am back, and today I'm making a habitat for a very funky antelope, the Saiga, a wielder of a very splendid, particularly rotund nose. But before I get into habitat building, I had to make the difficult decision of what path to use for this zoo. This zoo is actually going to be part of a bigger video. I won't spoil which one, but since in the bigger videos I try to spend less than a minute talking about each habitat, I made the decision to give each habitat a dedicated video. Either way though, after the staff buildings were in place, I hired everyone that the zoo is going to need. I got started with looking up how many Saiga I was going to need and how big of a barrier I needed to make. And because the animal market didn't have the Saiga I wanted in stock, I set up this axolotl exhibit to pass the time, after which I was able to get my hands on the Saiga I wanted, and went about setting up a wooden walkthrough habitat for them. I also decided to add one-way glass along the guest path, because I have a bad habit of not thinking ahead, and I always have to add one-way glass later, typically to a habitat that I already like the look of, but not this time. With the one-way glass in place, I had the Saiga brought to the habitat, where I went about placing down their water source, before changing the barrier from wood to chain link and adding donation bins. After which I placed a feeding trough down and promptly ran out of money. Also, while I was waiting for money to build back up, I realized that I had the one-way glass facing the wrong way. I'd like to say that that's a rare occurrence, but it happens more often than I'm willing to admit. After a not so inconsiderable amount of time, I realized that I just wasn't going to make enough money to finish this habitat, so I made the decision to head to my cheetah zoo, where I stored a handful of cheetahs in my animal market before bringing them back to this zoo to sell for a pretty penny. Funny how that works. With the necessary funds in place, I pulled out the rocks, using the desert rocks specifically to line the back of the water. I briefly considered adding a waterfall, but decided not to. I added a few doom palms around the back of the water, after which I placed a few salt cedar bushes around, which added a fun little pop of color. I then used these tiny bushes to sink into the rocks. I pulled out the sentry plants, which I placed mostly around the purple bushes, and with what foliage I knew I wanted in place, I pulled up the construction tab to make a shelter, where I found these blue pieces that I really wanted to use for the shelter. But after adding some pillars and sinking some doom palms into the ground, it just wasn't working how I imagined it to. So I deleted the blue pieces and the pillars, leaving the sunken doom palms, and instead I placed this archway and found these blue wall pieces, which I used to make this very wonky looking wall, but that's okay, the walls are not going to be visible at the end anyway, and neither is the roof, which is why I used these thatch pieces to fill in the top as best I could. I also placed this funky little Saiga sign at the top of the archway, which I think added a fun touch. What wasn't fun though was the barrier being all chain link. So I changed the barrier along the back of the shelter and along the front of the habitat to wood. And after confirming that their shelter requirements were met, I pulled out some doom palms to cover the wall, after which I used these same bushes I sunk into the rocks to cover the top of the shelter. I also added some trees around the back because I thought it made it look better. And despite what I said in my last habitat building video, it is actually possible to use rocks to make a shelter look better, which is why I placed 2 clusters on top of the shelter. And I think this is the happiest I've been with a shelter I've made so far. It wasn't quite done yet though. I used some desert rocks along the outside before making a small cluster off to the side, which I placed around the large rocks I had added around the shelter and along the water. And after adding some quiet signs, I finished off the shelter by adding some bedding. I then went through and added the food and toy enrichment, which included this funny little scarecrow guy. I worked on the train next, starting with adding short grass along the rocks by the water and by the rocks outside the shelter. I placed most of the grass they wanted in the shelter though, because I had designed this habitat to look good with all the sand, not realizing that they wanted surprisingly little in their habitat. I pulled out the long grass next, placing it around the plants. I used the rock terrain after that, which I placed around the rocks. I used soil to map trails throughout the habitat, keeping it light so that the sand could still be seen. I then had to face the reality of adding quite a lot more grass throughout the habitat, which ended with an outline of short grass along the perimeter of the barrier, not adding a patch more than what met the requirement. I was then ready to add the final rocks to the habitat, starting with adding a line along the viewing area, and then deleting a lot of them because I didn't want them coming out onto the path. I then copied a segment of my water rocks to add along the back of the barrier to cover up some of the grass. I sank the rocks very low because I didn't want to risk the Saiga jumping out, and that was this habitat done. So that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!